dead and roasted. What can I get you?
Sometimes being American is so boring, what with my gold hockey medal and 1,200-calorie breakfasts. So I'm happy to say that I have a fun episode for you today that immerses us in a story straight from Scotland. A story about a man working to feed his family, but must endure the most hellish road in the world. This story, from One with the Contour, is titled The Drove Road. This is a tale from the Break Room. And you can find Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Follow us and leave us a rating if you like us. Thank you. My father was a livestock haulier in the Scottish Highlands for 31 years. He moved sheep and cattle between farms and markets across some of the most remote country in Britain, driving roads that don't appear on most maps, in weather that would keep sensible people indoors. In all that time, he only ever refused one route. If a contract required the B road between Kinloch Moor and Cannock, he passed it to another driver and took the financial hit. And if you asked him why, he would change the subject so fast, you'd find yourself talking about football or the price of diesel before you realized what happened. He did this for 3 decades, and in those 3 decades, he explained himself exactly once. On the second to last night of his life, no less, in a hospital room in Inverness in the winter of 2004. 30 years of Richmond Super Kings had turned his lungs into something that could barely process air, and the man in that bed was so far from the man I grew up with that I had to remind myself more than once that they were the same person. He'd lost 4 stone. His skin had gone the color of dishwater. He breathed through a mask that fogged over with each exhale and cleared just enough between breaths to show his mouth moving underneath. And most of what he said in those final days was fragmented, drifting, half dissolved by morphine and exhaustion. But on that second to last night, when I was sitting beside his bed during a late visit because my mum had gone home to sleep and someone needed to be there, he turned his head on the pillow and looked at me with perfect clarity, saying, "Close the door." I closed it. He said to me, "Sit down." And so I sat. He then told me about the Drove Road, and he told it from beginning to end in a level and steady voice. But his eyes stayed fixated on the ceiling the entire time, like he was reading the story off the tiles. He talked for about an hour. When he was done, he closed his eyes for some time. I sat there, wordless, because there was nothing adequate to reply with. He died the following morning at 6:30. I was in the corridor getting coffee from the machine when it happened. That became one of those details that really shouldn't matter, but now I can't stop thinking about. Why was I grabbing coffee? Did it really matter? I've never repeated what he told me that night, but I am going to now. I'm 57 years old now, and this story deserves to be told. Also, as a note before I begin, I've changed all instances of kilometers to miles. I've spent most of my life in America at this point, and I know most people reading this will likely be American too. My father, Alistair, grew up in a village near Bewley, about 12 miles west of Inverness. He left school at 15. School wasn't producing results for anyone involved, and he got work on farms around the Glen, which in the Highlands in the late 1950s was less a career choice than a gravitational inevitability. He was good with animals, and good with engines too, but not particularly good with people, which is a combination that either makes you a mechanic or a haulier. When he got his HGV license at 20, he found that driving a loaded truck through empty landscape for hours at a stretch suited him quite well. He bought a second-hand Bedford TK from a dealer in Dingwall, and a livestock trailer from a farmer in Muir of Ord who was getting out of sheep. And by his mid-20s, he was making a decent living moving animals around the north of Scotland. Livestock haulage is unglamorous work, and I won't dwell on it long, but you need to understand a few things to follow what happened. A Hollier's reputation depends on delivering animals in the same condition he collected them. Stressed sheep lose weight, panicked sheep trample each other. A bruise on a ewe's flank or a limp that wasn't there at loading is a mark against the driver, and enough marks mean farmers stop calling. My father was careful. He checked his trailer before every job. The floor, the walls, partition gates, bolts and hinges and welds. You see, a loose fitting or a sharp edge in a livestock trailer is a liability, and because he took a workman's pride in doing the job properly, he checked it thoroughly. I say this to you so you understand that when animals came off his trailer injured, he knew it wasn't the trailer. In the autumn of 1972, my father had said late October or early November, but he wasn't certain on the exact date. But he picked up a contract from a farmer named Drummond. Drummond ran a hill farm in a remote glen west of Cannock, which itself is a remote place, and he needed 60-odd black-face ewes moved to a lowland farm near Bewley for winter grazing. The distance was about 30 miles of road, but the route mattered more than the distance, because the most direct way between the 2 points involved a 12-mile stretch of single-track B road that crossed open moorland between the 2 glens. This road followed the line of what was locally called the Drove Road. Drove roads are old routes, some of them medieval, which were used for centuries to walk livestock to market. Scotland is full of them. Most have been paved over or absorbed into the modern road network, and you would never know you were driving on one unless someone told you. This one, though, was different, at least according to my father, because the locals still called it by a Gaelic name that he said translated to something like the Road of the Carried Dead. It had been a corpse road before it was a drove road, the path along which the dead were carried from the remote communities in the western glens to consecrated ground in the east. My father mentioned this as a background detail, but I could hear something underneath the words even through the morphine and the steady tone, something that suggested he wished he'd paid more attention to it at the time. He had driven the road before without incident, though he noted, and I remember him pausing here briefly as if catching himself, that he had always driven it during daylight. The Drummond contract was different because of the logistics. Drummond's farm was at the end of a 5-mile track that was more suggestion than road, and the loading process with hill sheep is slow. Because the animals are half wild, they don't share the lowland sheep's resignation about being pushed into a trailer. By the time Alistair got the first batch loaded and cleared the farm track and reached the B road, the light would be gone. November in the Scottish Highlands means the sun sets at 4:30, and 4:30 comes faster than you expect when you're wrestling black-face ewes up a ramp. I should describe the road here. It's a single-track tarmac with passing places, no markings, no cat's eyes, no lighting. It crosses open moorland, flat peat bog stretching away on both sides, treeless, featureless, with low hills on the horizon that are more felt than seen after dark. The road sits slightly raised above the bog, like a causeway, which means that in wet weather, the standing water on either side reflects your headlights back at you, and it can feel like driving across a black lake on a narrow bridge. In daylight, it's bleak but manageable. After dark, with nothing ahead of you but the reach of your headlamps and nothing behind but whatever you've already passed, it becomes something else. My father described it as driving through the inside of a closed eye. The first trip was in late October. He loaded 20-odd ewes at Drummond's place in the late afternoon. Drummond was there to help. My father described him as the kind of older Highland farmer who communicates primarily through hand gestures and monosyllabic instructions, delivered at a volume meant for someone standing 50 yards away on a hillside. They got the sheep loaded, Drummond closed the trailer gate and bolted it. Then my father pulled out. He made it to the moor road at dusk. The last of the daylight was a thin orange band on the western horizon, and the road ahead was already dark enough to need headlights. The sheep in the trailer were settled, which was what you wanted. The ramp and the loading are the stressful parts, and once they're in and moving, they usually calm down. He drove the 12-mile stretch at a steady 40, which is about as fast as you'd want to push a loaded livestock trailer on a single track. About halfway across, he noticed the time. The 12 miles at 40 should take roughly 18 minutes, and he'd been driving for what felt like about that long. But the cattle grid at the far end of the moor, the landmark that meant you were off the open ground and dropping into the next glen, had not yet appeared. He checked his watch. 25 minutes. He wasn't worried yet, just mildly confused. He thought perhaps he had misjudged his start time, or maybe he had gone slower than he'd thought. Maybe both. So he kept driving. The cattle grid appeared after 47 minutes on this 12-mile road. My father was not a man who made errors about things like speed and distance. He had been driving professionally for the better part of a decade by then, and he could estimate his speed within a mile or two per hour without looking at the dial. He knew how long 12 miles took at 40. It didn't take 47 minutes. He shrugged it off as something odd and carried on to the destination farm. Because practical men like him, well, they archive things away, and they carry on. After all, there's no useful response to a road being longer than it should be.
Score an affordable home makeover this spring thanks to Bob's Discount Furniture's wow-worthy everyday low prices. Save big on everything from trendy mid-century dining sets and top-rated Bobapedic mattresses to pop-up sleeper sectionals and deluxe dining sets. Stop in or shop online to get styling.
Even when business owners supposedly take a vacation, they're not on vacation. Their brains won't let them forget the business. While we can't fix that problem, Patriot Software makes your accounting and payroll accessible with your phone.
He unloaded at the receiving farm near Bewley. The farmer was a man called Geddes, and Geddes was waiting with the gate open and a torch in his hand, as it was past 7 by then and fully dark. They dropped the ramp and the sheep came out. The first 17 or 18 were fine. They trotted down the ramp and into the pen, in that stop-start uncertain way, like animals do when they're adjusting to solid ground after a moving floor. The last two, however, were limping. Both ewes, both favoring their front left leg, both with the same stiff, pained reluctance to put weight on it. And behind them, the last animal out, a ewe with a gash along her right flank that ran from just behind the shoulder almost to the hip. It was deep, deep enough that the flesh had parted, and you could see the pink of the muscle underneath. It was clean, almost surgically straight, as if it had been made with a blade, and not by an animal catching itself on some protruding edge. Geddes looked at the injuries, then at my father. My father said it wasn't quite an accusatory look he gave him, but certainly something that wanted explanation. Yet my father didn't have one. He had checked the trailer before loading, as he always did, and there was nothing in it that could produce a wound like that. Geddes cleaned the gash with iodine and wrapped it, and they agreed that the ewes must have knocked into each other during transit, which can happen when animals panic and scramble. Except these sheep had never panicked, not during the ride. They had been calm the entire way. My father had listened to the sounds of distress before. Stamping, bleating, the thud of bodies hitting the trailer walls, and had heard nothing on this trip. He drove home to Bewley and told my mother the delivery had gone fine. I mean, in the accounting of his mind, it had. Sheep sometimes arrive with injuries. Sometimes they have injuries as they load and you miss it. It was an imperfect business. He went to bed, he slept, and if he dreamed about anything, he didn't remember it in the morning. The second trip was 4 days later. The same route and the same time of day. Same conditions. An afternoon loading and a dusk departure that put him on the moor road after dark. This time he watched his clock from the moment his tires hit the single track. He drove at a careful, consistent 40, and he did not speed up or slow down, and he counted the minutes. The 12-mile crossing took 44 minutes, which at 40 miles per hour is a distance of just over 29 miles. The road was 12 miles long. He had just driven 29. He said nothing about this to anyone. It didn't make sense. He didn't want to dwell on it. Perhaps there was an error. If it was an error, it was not in his equipment, though. It had to be on the road. Perhaps the signs, perhaps something. He didn't know. At the Geddes farm, they unloaded. 3 ewes were injured this time, all with the same clean lacerations on the left side of the body, like something in the trailer was making a single cut across each animal at the same height and from the same direction. And there was one more, too. She was standing at the back of the trailer, facing the wall when they opened the gate. She didn't move when the others filed out, and when Geddes climbed in, coaxing her to turn around, he stepped back and said something under his breath in Gaelic that my father didn't catch. The poor thing's left eye was gone. The socket was open and empty and clean, like the eye had been lifted out by a surgeon, not torn or burst, and there was almost no blood. Maybe some thin, dry residue on the wool below the socket, but that's it. The ewe stood there and looked at them with her remaining eye, and she was calm. Entirely, horribly calm. My father wondered if it was adrenaline caused by the pain and fear. He and Geddes stood in the yard with a torch beam on that empty socket, and they didn't talk as they observed. Eventually, Geddes said it must have been a bolt, maybe a rough edge in the trailer, something the ewe had pressed her face against. My father knew every surface in that trailer down to the inch, and there was nothing that could do what had been done. He and Geddes both knew this, but neither of them said so out loud, and that knowing sat between them like a stone. He drove home. He checked the trailer in the morning with a torch, running his hands over every surface, every join, and every bolt head. But he didn't find anything out of place. The interior walls were smooth, galvanized steel. The floor was clean. He couldn't even find blood anywhere, which itself was messed up. A wound like that eye, especially, should have left blood on the floor, on the walls, or somewhere. The trailer was as clean as the day he had loaded it. That night he dreamed he was walking the moor road in the dark, on foot, alone. There was something behind him matching his pace step for step, with a half-second delay, so that each of his footfalls produced an echo that was not quite an echo, as it came from the wrong direction. He walked for hours, and the road did not end. He woke up in his bed, with his heart going a mile a minute, and my mom asleep beside him. He told himself it was a dream. Then he went downstairs and found his work boots by the front door, with black peat mud on the soles. He stood there in the kitchen in the early light and looked at those boots. You see, he did not own peat land, and he had not gone outside as far as he could remember. My father nearly refused the third run. He phoned Drummond and said he was busy, which was a lie. November was slow, and he had no other contracts that week. Drummond offered more money, and my father said it wasn't the money. Drummond then cleared his throat and asked, "Your wife's expecting, isn't she?" And my father said yes. My mother was 6 months pregnant with me at the time, a detail I've never been able to sit comfortably with. Drummond then explained how he needed the work, and so offered him double the rate. My father said no, so Drummond said something else. My father repeated it to me in the hospital, exactly as he remembered it. And I'll do that for you as well. Drummond had said, "You've been across 3 times now, Alistair. Twice there, once back empty. That's 3 crossings of a road that wants 4. You think it matters whether you're driving it? You walked it last night in your sleep. It'll have you walking it every night until you finish what you started, or until it finishes for you." My father asked how Drummond knew about the walking, but he didn't answer that. Instead, he said, "Finish the contract. 4 loaded crossings, that's a full drove. That's what the road wants. Leave it at 3, and that there's unfinished business. And that road has been collecting unfinished business since before your grandfather's grandfather was born." My father took the job. I don't know why. He didn't explain his reasoning to me, and I've spent 2 decades considering the possibilities, and I still can't settle on one. The money was part of it. We were not well off, and a baby was coming, Double rate for a day's work was not something he could dismiss easily. But obviously it was more than that. I think Drummond's mention of the sleepwalking frightened him in such a way. It confirmed that what was happening was not contained to the road. It was following him home. The peat on his boots, the dreams, the road reaching into his house while he slept. If Drummond was right, then driving the road again was not adding to the danger. The danger was already present, accumulating, and the only way to discharge it was to complete the crossing, give the road what it wanted. He loaded the third batch at Drummond's farm on a gray afternoon in the second week of November. The sky was low and flat. The highland was overcast, making it impossible to tell where the sun was or how much light you had left. And the darkness, when it came, arrived without a transitional period. 1 minute, the moor was visible in washed-out gray, and the next, the headlights were cutting tunnels through solid black. He was on the moor road by 4:45. At mile 6, confirmed by his odometer, which he was now checking obsessively, he saw the figure. It was on the road ahead of him, walking the left-hand edge in the same direction he was traveling. His headlights picked it up at about 100 yards. The outline of a person, tall, wearing what appeared to be a long coat, hunched forward under the weight of something draped across his shoulders. The posture was that of a man carrying a heavy load, bent at the waist, arms raised to grip whatever was slung behind his neck. My father's first thought was that it was a stalker, not what you'd think when you hear the word stalker, but rather a deer hunter coming off the hill with a carcass. You carry a deer across your shoulders with the legs hanging down your chest, and from behind in poor light, that's approximately what this looked like. He slowed the truck. The road was single track and there was no room to pass without the figure stepping aside, so he dropped to walking pace and flashed his headlights. The figure, though, did not react. He tapped his horn, a short bleat that sounded enormous in the moorland silence, but no response. The figure kept walking at the same pace. My father rolled along behind it at 5 miles per hour, with his headlights fully on its back, and so more details began to resolve. The coat was long past the knees, and it was not a modern garment. My father said it looked heavy and shapeless, like rough wool or oilskin that you see in old photographs of agricultural workers from a century ago. The figure moved wrong too, stiff and repetitive, like the legs beneath the coat were operating on a mechanism, not through muscular intent. Each step was identical to the last in length and timing, no variation, no adjustment for the camber of the road or the rough surface. This was not like a living man's walk, constantly adapting to the ground beneath them. This was a walk that had been fixed and placed, and was simply repeating. The thing across its shoulders was no deer. The legs hanging down the figure's chest. My father could see them clearly now in the headlights, swaying with each step, were too thin and ended in small cloven hooves, and there were too many of them. He counted at least 4 distinct legs, possibly 6, layered over each other, which meant the figure was carrying more than one animal. Sheep. Dead sheep. Draped and stacked across its shoulders, and it was walking the Drove Road at 5 o'clock on a November night, as though this were a task it had been performing for a very long time, and intended to perform for a great deal longer. My father stopped the truck. He told me he didn't know why he did. Every functioning part of his brain was telling him to accelerate and get clear of this, but his foot went to the brake, and his hands went still. He sat in the idling cab with his headlights on the figure 20 yards ahead. He couldn't look away from it, and he couldn't move. He said it was like the road was holding him there, like he was trapped in some unseen current, Some unseen force had interposed itself and had told him to wait. The sheep in the trailer then started screaming. My father used that word specifically, and I'll use it here. He was a man who had spent his adult life around livestock. He knew the full range of sounds they make, and what came out of that trailer was not bleating and was not distress calls. It was a sound he had never heard from sheep before, and he said it was the sound of animals who knew, in whatever limited way that sheep could know anything, that something was present that was fundamentally incompatible with their being alive. The sound broke whatever was holding him. He released the brake, put the truck in second, and floored the accelerator. The Bedford lurched past the figure on the narrow road, doing 50 on a surface that was barely safe at 30. As he passed, he looked to his left through the driver's side window, and the figure was there, close enough that he could have reached out and touched it if the glass hadn't been between them. He saw its face then. My father described this once. Back in that hospital bed with his eyes on the ceiling, his voice perfectly steady, and his free hand gripping the bed rail so hard that the tendons rose up through the skin like cables. When he was done describing it, he closed his eyes and didn't open them for a full minute. I sat there and listened to his breathing apparatus cycle, and I didn't say a word. The face had been a man's face. My father was certain of this. The underlying structure was human, the proportions were human. The basic architecture of brow and cheekbone and jaw was that of a grown man. But the flesh over that structure had been transformed in a way that my father could only compare to the photographs he'd seen of bog bodies pulled from peat. The skin darkened to a deep reddish brown, compressed tight against the skull, shrunk and hardened by acid and time until it was less skin than leather, the lips drawn back from the teeth in a permanent, involuntary grimace, the sockets deep and shadowed, peat preserved, tanned by centuries in the ground. The ground tans everything it keeps long enough. The eyes in those sockets were open. They were wet, and they moved. They tracked the truck as it passed, and my father said that in the half-second he saw them, he understood that the face was dead, but that the eyes were not. That contradiction was the worst part. Something was looking out of that face that had no business being behind dead eyes, and it saw him clearly. And yet it was not surprised to see him there. He drove the remaining 6 miles without slowing down. His odometer recorded the distance as 9. He was past questioning this by then. At the Geddes farm, they opened the trailer. 14 of the 15 sheep walked out in good order. The 15th was at the back of the trailer, at the far corner, and it wasn't standing up. Now I must describe what my father described to me, and I'll do it plainly, though it is bizarre and disturbing. The ewe was on its side. It was definitely alive. My father could see its ribcage moving, shallow but rapid breathing. Its eyes were open, and its legs were making small rhythmic paddling motions, like a dying animal's legs moving as the nervous system fails. But the animal's not dying from any wound or impact. Well, nothing that made sense anyway. You see, its abdomen had been opened up. The skin and wool of the belly had been parted along a line so clean and straight, it looked measured, from the sternum to the pelvis, and the 2 flaps of skin had been folded back, laid flat against the ground on either side of the body, like the pages of some book. The interior of the animal was exposed. Organs, musculature, the architecture of a living sheep presented in cross-section, as though for a veterinary demonstration. The organs had been rearranged. The stomach and intestines, which should have been in the abdominal cavity, had been drawn out and placed on the exterior of the body in positions that corresponded roughly to where they would sit if the animals inside and outside had been reversed. The liver was where the wool should have been. The wool was underneath. Everything was in the wrong place, but arranged with intent. Something with horrible creativity had opened this animal up and tried to put it back together according to a different set of instructions. Somehow, the ewe was breathing through all of this. Its legs were still paddling. Its eye, the one my father could see, was open and looking at nothing. My father and Getty stood at the back of that trailer in the dark farmyard with a single torch beam on the poor animal, and neither of them said a word. My father said they stood there for minutes, which feels like years when you're standing in silence looking at something impossible. Geddes then climbed into the trailer, cutting the ewe's throat with his penknife. The breathing stopped. The legs stopped. And that was that.
Grip, stability, precision. That's the essence of driving. Lawfin.
Writing a book is hard. Knowing if it's good, even harder. Neat manuscript analysis.
They dragged the remains out of the trailer, burying them behind the farm buildings in the dark, working by torchlight. When the hole was filled and the ground stamped flat, Geddes stuck his spade in the earth, leaning on it, and said, "Don't bring any more animals down that damned road." My father explained that he still had one more trip. Geddes gave him a look and said, "My father used to haulage sheep before me, and his father before him. Nobody in my family drives after dark on the moor road, and I'd suggest you arrive at the same policy." He picked up his spade and walked away. My father drove home. He didn't sleep well that night. In fact, he first stayed in the kitchen in the dark with a cup of tea, sort of just listening to the house. He tried to find a way to make what he had seen fit into a normal world, but he failed to do so. The days after the third trip were the part of the story my father told with the least detail. I think this was not because nothing happened, but because what happened was personal. And even on his deathbed, there were things he didn't want to hand down to his son. He said he felt different, that food had lost its familiar taste. Even the reflection in the bathroom mirror seemed delayed or lagged by the smallest fraction of a second, but he could feel it. And he had dreams every night. The moor road, footsteps behind him, the walk that didn't end, and every morning, the boots were by the door with fresh peat on the soles. My mother noticed. She was not an easily frightened woman, but my father said she had begun watching him with a quality of attention associated with waiting rooms. Patient, alert, braced for any kind of news. One evening she told him he smelled different. He asked what she meant. She said she could not describe it, except that it wasn't him. The smell of his very skin had changed, and she looked afraid, likely because my father wasn't sick. And if he was, that would be treatable. This wasn't. Drummond eventually called. One more trip, the final batch. 15 ewes, finish the contract, finish the drove, and be done. My father said yes. Drummond's warning was the last thing my father heard before he pulled out of the farm track onto the B road for the final time. They'd loaded the 15 ewes in near silence, working quickly in the afternoon light, and as my father climbed into the cab, Drummond put his hand on the doorframe, and he held it there so that the door couldn't close. He looked my father dead in the eye, and he said, "Don't stop. Whatever you see on that road, don't stop the truck. If it stalls, you stay in the cab. Do not put your feet on that road after dark." My father asked what would happen if he did. Drummond took his hand off the doorframe and said, "Then you'll join the drove." He stepped back, and my father closed the door. that was the last time the two men spoke. It was 3:30 when he reached the B road. Sunset was at 4:30. 12 miles at 45 would take 16 minutes. He would be off the moor and through the cattle grid with daylight to spare. My father said he felt something close to optimism as he turned onto the single track, which tells you how far his calibration had shifted over the preceding weeks. That the prospect of driving a road that had mutilated livestock and put living eyes in a dead man's face could produce anything resembling relief. But he had daylight, and he had speed, and he had an engine that had never let him down. In 16 minutes, it should be over. The moor opened up on either side as the road climbed away from the glen. Brown peat, gray sky, hills on the horizon just visible through a thin haze. He set his speed at 45 and watched the odometer and drove. At mile 3, the sky changed. The overcast, which had been a uniform gray sheet all day, thickened and dropped. This man had driven through highland squalls and hill fog, even through horizontal rain so bad it reduced visibility to the length of the bonnet. But this was strange. The light simply left. No fade whatsoever. The light was simply removed. He checked his watch. 3:50. The sunset should not have been for another 40 minutes. The dark had come early, and it came all at once. There was nothing natural about this. He pressed his accelerator. The engine responded, but the truck felt heavy suddenly, sluggish, laboring, like it was having trouble pulling the additional weight of the trailer now. The temperature gauge, which normally sat comfortably in the middle third of its range, began to climb. He was doing 45 by the speedometer, but the sensation of speed was wrong too. The road ahead unspooled in his headlights at a pace that felt closer to 30. Mile 6. The halfway point on a 12-mile road, except by now he had no faith that that road was 12 miles. He drove and he watched the odometer count, and he kept his hands tight on the wheel. The sheep in the trailer stayed silent. He had been listening for them since the start of the drive, but he'd heard nothing. Over a dozen animals standing in a metal box in a moving vehicle eventually produced some sound, but these were producing nothing. It had been so completely quiet behind him that if he hadn't loaded them himself an hour earlier, he could have believed that the trailer was empty. Mile 9. No cattle grid. The moor road continued ahead of him, straight and featureless, the headlights reaching maybe 80 yards before the dark swallowed them. The temperature gauge was nudging the red. The engine note had changed from the steady diesel thrum that he knew as well as his heartbeat to something strained and arrhythmic, a machine working against a resistance which it was not designed for. He checked the wing mirror on the driver's side, a habit of his. A haulier does this every few minutes without thinking about it. There, in the red wash of the taillights, at the furthest edge of what the glow could reach, there were shapes on the road behind him. They were low and pale, moving in a loose formation that spread across the width of the road and the verges on either side. Sheep. There were sheep on the road behind his trailer, following him across the moor, and there were far more of them than the 15 he was carrying. He could see dozens. They filled the road from edge to edge and extended back beyond the reach of his taillights into a darkness that could have contained any number more. They were walking at the same pace as his truck, keeping a steady distance, and even in the dim red light and the small shaking rectangle of the wing mirror, he could see that they were not normal. Like that figure from before, they moved stiffly and uniformly, every animal moving in the same rhythm, legs working in lockstep that normal sheep would never do. Some of them were even walking on legs that were bent oddly, which would make it impossible for a living animal to stand on, let alone move with. One near the front of the flock, where the tail light was strongest, had its head hanging sideways from a clearly broken neck. The skull was resting against its own shoulder, and it walked the same steady pace as the rest. Their wool was dark and matted, with something that looked like mud but wasn't, and the ones closest to the light had a quality to their bodies that my father struggled to articulate, that I will try to convey as precisely as I can. They looked compressed, flattened, as though they had been subject to enormous pressure that had pushed them into a denser version of themselves, the way peat pushes everything into a tighter, darker, more preserved form. My father faced forward and put his foot down. The engine screamed, the speedometer read 50, but that road was not meant for 50. The truck shuddered and swayed, and he held the wheel with both hands, determined to keep driving, due to what Drummond had told him, and because looking in that mirror again was something that he could not bring himself to do. Mile 14. There was no cattle grid still. The road should have ended 2 miles ago by any honest measurement, and it had not ended. The engine temperature was in the red, and the needle was still climbing. My father could smell hot metal and coolant, and he knew that the truck was about to die, and there was nothing he could do about it. It died at mile 15. Like a dying man's pulse, the engine stopped. Mid-beat, total, without the courtesy of a gradual failure. The truck rolled forward on its remaining momentum, slowing, and came to a rest on the empty road, with the headlights dimming to amber on battery power, and the dark closing in from every direction, like water filling a hole. He sat in the cab. He did not try the ignition. He knew the engine was gone, and he understood that turning the key would drain the battery faster, and the headlights were the only thing between him and absolute darkness. He wanted them for as long as they would last. The cab was cooling rapidly. The heater had died with the engine, and the November cold came in through the glass and the floor and the doors. Yet underneath that cold was the other cold, the one he'd felt on the moor road from the first trip. Wet and organic, carrying the smell of deep peat, the smell of ground full of dead things. In the wing mirror, the flock had stopped. They stood on the road behind the trailer in a dense, still mass, and in the fading taillight, they almost looked like ordinary sheep if you kept your focus soft and did not look too closely. My father did not examine them closely either. He glanced once, then he faced forward, placing his hands on the wheel as he waited. The flock parted. He heard that part rather than saw it. The sound of hooves on tarmac shifting to either side, pressing to the verges to open a path through their center. And through that center, at a pace that matched the mechanical rhythm of the flock's walking, came the sound of footsteps. Heavy steps, accompanied by a wet, dragging sound underneath, as though this new figure was leaving a trail on the road's surface. The footsteps passed along the left side of the trailer, close enough that my father could hear the brush of the long coat against the metal sidewall. And then they were alongside the truck. Then they were alongside the cab. And then they stopped outside the driver's door. My father didn't look. He stared through the windshield at the last pale cone of his failing headlights on the empty road ahead. He kept his hands on the wheel, and he didn't turn his head. He could hear it, though. Hear it standing there inches from the glass, the sound of its breathing thin and papery. Beneath the breathing, he could hear other smaller sounds. The faint creak of the weight across its shoulders shifting, the slow drip of something landing on the tarmac below, the soft, wet contact of the dead sheep's hooves swaying against the figure's chest. And it stood there for so long. But my father didn't count. He said that time lost its structure, because when you're in a situation like that, time loses its meaning. The only way he knew time was truly passing was the fact that the headlights were still getting dimmer, and that the cold was getting deeper. He gripped the wheel, and he did not look at it. He did not speak to it. He refused to move. Suddenly, the glass made a sound, a high and thin sound, like something hard being drawn down a smooth surface. My father kept his eyes forward, but he could see it in his peripheral vision. The movement on the driver's side window, the dark shape at the glass. The sound continued, a slow, downward stroke, from the top of the window to the bottom. Then another, parallel to the first, and another. 4 strokes altogether, 4 lines or grooves being inscribed into the exterior of the glass by something that was not a fingernail, and was not a tool, and was, as far as my father's peripheral vision could tell, the tip of a bare, dark, and hardened finger. The sound stopped. The breathing continued for a few more seconds, but then the footsteps resumed, moving past the cab, past the bonnet, and now onto the road ahead. The dragging sound went with it, and the flock on the verges began to move, falling in line behind the figure. The whole procession, the shepherd and his dead drove, walked north along the moor road until the sound of their passage faded and the night was silent. My father was alone. He waited, maybe 5 minutes. He could not have waited longer because his body was shaking with a violence that made it difficult to keep his hands on the wheel, and the cold had gotten into him, touching his very core. He turned the key, and the engine started right away, turning over on the first attempt with a healthy, steady note. It was like the dang thing had never stopped. The headlights brightened, the temperature gauge sat in the middle of its range, and the cab began to warm up. He put the truck in gear and drove. The cattle grid appeared less than 2 miles later, exactly where the map said it should be, and he crossed it, and the road dropped into the glen, and the moor was behind him. He did not look back. At the Geddes farm, the farmer had agreed to receive this final batch despite what he'd said before. My father never explained how that arrangement had been made. They opened the trailer. 14 sheep came out, healthy, uninjured, and calm. 14, not 15. The trailer was sealed, bolted from the outside. There was no gap or breach anywhere in its construction, nowhere for a 60-kilogram animal to leave through. 14 sheep walked into the pen, and the 15th simply did not exist. There was no body, no blood, no wool, and no hoofprint. There was no indication that a 15th animal had ever been in the trailer at all. Geddes counted twice. So did my father. 14. Geddes looked at my father across the pen gate, and my father looked back. Geddes took out his delivery book, signed the receipt for 15, and put the book away. He closed the pen and walked toward his house without turning around. My father drove home to Bewley in the dark with the heater on full and the radio playing. His hands were steady on the wheel, and his mind was blank. He parked outside his house and sat in the cab for a while before finally going inside. He didn't check the trailer. He never checked that trailer again. He never drove that moor road again either. The contract was finished. Drummond never called, and my father never inquired. He learned years later and secondhand that Drummond had been found dead on the moor road in the spring of 1979. They found him sitting upright against a fence post with his crook across his lap, dead of exposure on a night when the temperature had not dropped below 7 degrees. The man who told my father about this said Drummond looked like he had been sitting there for a long time, though the pathologist report put the death at only a few hours before the body was found. My father received this information, said nothing, and changed the subject. Those changes my father dealt with, well, they faded. The dreams stopped within a month or so. The peat mud stopped appearing on his boots. The strange thing about his reflection even settled. My mother stopped watching him, and the smell she had noticed went away. By the time I was born in February of 1973, my father was, by all external measures, the same man he'd been before the contract. He went back to work. He hauled livestock for another 28 years, and he never spoke about what happened, never drove that road. But he was a different man. But because I grew up inside that difference, I wasn't able to name it myself. But I knew that he flinched at dead animals on the roadside. Not the typical grimace that you might make, but a full-body recoil, a jerk of the head away, as though the sight was physically painful. He wouldn't walk on unpaved ground after dark, which in the rural highlands is a significant constraint. And if circumstances forced it, he moved with a rigid, mechanical haste that I now recognize as a man trying to spend as little time as possible with his feet on open earth. He kept the radio on every waking hour in every room he occupied, a low and continuous murmur of voices and music that didn't really serve an entertainment purpose. He really didn't listen to it himself. It was just sound to fill the quiet, made him feel less alone. A few years after he died, I flew out to visit my mom, and I went to look at the truck. The Bedford was still in the barn where he'd parked it after his last job, covered in dust and pigeon droppings, but structurally intact. I opened the cab door and sat in the driver's seat. I mean, my father had spent more hours in that seat than in any chair in our house. There was something of him still in the worn vinyl, and the position of the mirrors, and the faint smell of diesel and livestock. I looked at the driver's side window. The scratches were still there. 4 vertical lines scored into the exterior surface, running from the top to the bottom, deep enough to catch a fingernail when I ran my hand across them on the outside. These weren't cracks. They weren't random marks of road debris or scraped branches. They were a warning, and they were proof that my dad's story was more true than I liked to believe. I feel like roads can be haunted like houses can be haunted, but one seems far worse. If you're trapped in a haunted house, you cover your head, you ignore the ghosts, and you wait for dawn. But a haunted road, well, you're at the mercy of the infinite darkness, my friend, and whatever lurks within it. Good night. Thank you all so much for tuning into this episode of Tales from the Break Room. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails. You can send me your scary work-related stories at eeriecast.com/submit.